Imagine holding a canvas so small that it barely fits in your hand, and yet within it lies the potential to reshape the way that you see art and even yourself. A few weeks ago, I introduced my 100 Tiny Paintings in a Year quest, and I've been truly moved by how many of you have joined me on this journey. And today, after receiving so many questions about my process, I'm inviting you to come behind the scenes with me as I create this tiny painting. So let's get into it. The first thing I think about in any drawing or painting is the composition. In my experience, having a strong composition is half the battle. I took this photo a few years ago on vacation in Wisconsin. I love the teal color of the roof, the old-fashioned windmill, and the telephone poles that frame the farmhouse, and also all of the bushes and trees that are layered around it. I've painted this one before on very poor paper, and although I loved the composition, I struggled to get the paint to flow on this paper. I chose a vertical composition to emphasize the house and telephone poles and to give the painting some depth. And today I want to paint it again, but with a horizontal composition this time. I'm going to slightly alter the height of the tree behind the house and change the bushes on the right so that they don't overpower the composition. I'll eliminate this big bush and move over these smaller ones and the tree on the right. And for the foreground, I'll be more impressionistic, but I want to make sure that I include these light green grasses and give an indication of some of the colors. I'm using a tiny piece of Arches 100% cotton cold-pressed watercolor paper cut to 2 by 1 1/4 inches. For watercolor, I'll use my Octagon Palette. I'm fairly new to using this brand, but I've loved the vibrancy of the colors in all of the paintings that I've done with it so far. If you want to paint along, you can use similar colors of any brand. I recently got this adorable tiny clipboard from Blue Star Crafts that perfectly holds this tiny paper, but any little board or hard surface will work. I think it's nice to have something you can easily hold in your hand. I like to tape it down using washi tape to both keep it steady while I paint and also create a border. I always begin with a sketch. I like to use mechanical pencils for tiny paintings because I want a thinner line that isn't going to smudge. I'd recommend a 0.5 millimeter lead or even a 0.3 millimeters. I think the biggest obstacle when you first start to paint tiny after painting normal sized compositions is to scale down all of the objects. I think a good way to tackle this obstacle is to start with one small object that you know exactly the size and placement of where you want it on the painting. So for this, I'm starting roughly with the horizon line, but then I also want to block in that tiny farmhouse. I'm choosing to make it a little bit bigger than it is because I do want it to be the main focal point of this composition. So I don't want it to be too small. So I'm sketching in the overall peak of the dormer and shape of the house, and then placing the telephone poles exactly where I want them. I want to make sure that they're offset a little bit to the left of the house, that the one that's further back is smaller, and that the one that's in the foreground is taller than the house by about twice the size at least. I love this jaunty little windmill, so I'm making sure that I get the placement of that pretty good. And then from there, I'm just roughly sketching in where I want the main bushes and that tree on the right to be. I don't usually get too detailed with my sketches. I think of them basically as the main placeholder for all of the items in the painting. Many artists will go straight in with ink, but I just feel comfortable working in pencil, and I like the fact that once I see the painting, if I want to change things around or alter things slightly, it makes it a lot easier to do that. Once I've put all of the elements where I want them to be, I take a minute or two and just go around and finesse everything. I double check to make sure that all of the proportions are correct and fine tune any of the areas where I find that things just don't quite look right. And again, I'm not doing too much detail at this point. I'm just putting down the main bones of the picture. If it looks good at this stage, then chances are it's going to look good at the inking stage and also the painting stage. It's very easy to overthink this stage, but I honestly find it's best to try to think of it intuitively. So you start with one object that you know the size and place it wants to be, and then you measure all of the other objects against that one. So is it taller or shorter, or how far away is it? I use that first object as a unit of measurement for the whole rest of the drawing. And once I have the main bones down, I'll go in with ink. I'm using this 005 brown Prismacolor Premier fine liner. I don't even know how easy these are to find anymore. They used to sell them at the Michaels stores in America, but I haven't been able to find them at the Michaels stores near my mom's house in my last few visits. So this is an older one. I like to use a 005 or a 01 fine liner for these sketches because it is so tiny and I don't want the lines to be too thick. I'd rather keep them really thin and build them up as needed. I like to use brown because it's less dominant in a tiny painting than black. I personally have found that using black ink is just too harsh for a tiny painting, and it really detracts from having it look like fine art. You can also experiment with gray or blue or just be fun with the colors, but I would really steer people away from using black. And at this point, I just use the fine liner to go over the areas of my sketch that I really want to be emphasized. So in this case, it's the little house, the windmill, and the telephone poles, and even those wires of the telephone pole. And then I'm sketching in the main shrubs and trees and paying a little bit more attention to putting some shadows in at the base of those elements. And other than that, I'm keeping it pretty simple with the ink. I can always come back later and add more ink, but I can't take it away once it's down. This inking stage is probably my most favorite part of doing any kind of a line and wash painting. I really just love drawing, and I love all of the texture that you can get from using ink in a watercolor painting. Sometimes I'm so in love with the drawings that I'm reluctant to put paint on them, but I've found with these very, very small paintings that a little bit really does go a long way, and that is true for all three stages: the drawing, the inking, and the painting. If you try this, and I hope that you do, I think you're going to be amazed at how little effort it takes compared to larger paintings. But little effort doesn't mean that it's easier, because I don't think that doing the tiny paintings is easier. It just requires more thoughtful mark making. And my basic philosophy for this is if it's a dark area where there's a lot of shading and texture, I'll add more ink. And if it's a lighter area, for instance, this area in the front where it's this light pale green grass, I will put very few marks in that area because I want to preserve the white of the paper. One thing the ink is really useful for is where you have hard or sharp edges. So because in this painting I have these two telephone poles, I want to make sure that those are very straight. So I'm taking the time to do that carefully with the ink. And the same goes for that dormer above the window on the house. I want that pitch to be pretty perfect, because if that looks good, then it doesn't matter if other things are imperfect. The eye is going to read that as being accurate as well. As far as this windmill, I'm aware of the fact that there is a lot of detail in it, but I have to be careful not to overdo it in this tiny painting, because I want it to be more of a supporting actor instead of the main lead of this painting. Again, I want the eye and the focal point to be this little farmhouse, and particularly the teal roof. So I'm just squinting as I'm drawing, and I see a few of the little blades of the windmill on the left side and just a bit of the curvature on the right. And then I'm just lightly marking down the frame. And I think that honestly, that's going to be enough for that element. And again, from there, I'm just taking a few minutes to finesse things, particularly in the bushes on the right, because I want to make it look like there are a few different varieties, as well as the bushes on the left. But again, unlike my original painting of this scene, I don't want this one to be as detailed. I want to leave more room for personal interpretation. Sometimes I will erase all of these pencil marks, but a lot of times, especially with these tiny paintings, I just leave it all in. Unless it's someplace like a sky or some area that I want to be very light and very clear, I think it adds a little bit of texture to leave the graphite where it is. I am going to add a little bit of masking fluid to this tiny painting because I want to preserve the lighter areas of those telephone poles, as well as a few of these teeny tiny rooftops over on the right. I'm just using my Molotov masking fluid marker for this one, but any masking fluid obviously would work. And now moving on to the final stage, which is the watercolor stage. I'll be using 3 different brushes. The main brush that I'm using is this number 6 pointed round from Rosemary Co, and it is a series 301. Honestly, I could do everything I need to do with just this brush. It's been my favorite brush lately to use. I'll also be using 2 other brushes from Rosemary Co, the number 4 red dot filbert, and honestly, I only use this a very little bit to try to lighten some colors later. And then I also used this 10/0 micro red dot brush. And I use this for a few fine details at the very end. I'm using the M-Gram watercolor paints. The colors in this palette are yellow ochre, bismuth yellow, Indian yellow, scarlet pyrrol, transparent red oxide, phthalo blue, and in the center, ultramarine blue. And I'm starting by mixing a sky color with the ultramarine blue and just a touch of the transparent red oxide to tone down the blue a little bit. And at the top, I'm just dotting in that color, leaving some white spaces for the clouds. I don't like to over fiddle with the sky on these tiny paintings because it can get overwhelming really quickly. So I'm just trying to get an impression of the sky down on the first pass. And for the lower part, as it gets closer to the horizon, the sky is a little bit brighter. So I'm adding a little bit more of the ultramarine, and I have to dilute it a little bit as I put it down, which you can see here. And then I just dot that around a bit into some of the other areas and just make sure that the whole sky is covered. And that's all I'm going to do for the sky. That will be it. Into that same mix, I'm taking some of the bismuth yellow to create a nice green color to put down my first pale coating for all of those bushes in the background. It's important to make sure that this mix is quite diluted because this is the first most pale coat, and a little bit really does go a long way in these tiny paintings. This 2 by 1 1/4 format is the smallest I've ever worked with, and I've only done a few so far, so I'm still working it out, but I'm always having to dilute things a little bit more than I'm used to, even on just a 2 by 2 inch canvas. I'm basically going to play with the same mixture with different ratios of yellow and blue, so I'm adding a little bit more of the bismuth yellow for a very light, pale, crisp green that I'm putting in the entire foreground. And in a separate little ceramic palette, I'm taking a bit of that same mixture of the blue and I'm adding a little bit of the yellow ochre to get an earthier, kind of a khaki green color for these bushes on the left. And I'm using this mixture for the sliver of barn that you see behind the house and also dotting a little bit of it into the bushes on the right and the grasses directly underneath them. And then you'll see I'm fiddling around with the mixture in my original palette. I'm trying to find a middle to dark green. Actually, you'll see here that I mix it a little bit darker than I initially wanted it to, but I just keep playing with the ratios until I get a color that I'm happy with. So I'm adding just different mixtures of the bismuth yellow, the ultramarine, and a dash of the transparent red oxide to tone it down a little bit so that it's not too bright. And I'm dotting that mixture into all of those bushes on the right and the tree, as well as the bushes on the left. And as I do this, I'm being conscious to leave some of the lighter values to shine through. Again, it is a little bit tricky to get this correct. I feel like my ratio of water was a little bit too dominant, and I probably should have worked a little more on the tip of the brush, but that's, again, just a learning experience. And to darken it up a little bit more and make it a little bit of an earthier color, I'm going into that second palette, adding a bit of this color with a little bit more of the transparent red oxide for a darker, earthier color. And I'm putting that in those bushes on the left. And then I'm taking some of that color and mixing it back into that original mix. And with that, I'm dotting it around. I like to do what I call spreading the love. So if I have a color in one area, I look for other areas of the composition where I see that same color. So here I'm just dotting it into some of these grasses in the foreground and over on the right, and also at the base of the house. And just a few touches over on that cluster of bushes on the right. From there, I'm most interested in mixing a color that's going to match what I want the rooftop to be. And although in the photograph, the color is quite similar to the trees around it, I remember in real life that it really was more vivid. And in this painting, because there are a lot of greens, I want it to stand out more. So I've cleaned my brush and I'm starting cautiously with this, with just a little bit of the bismuth and the phthalo blue, which does get dominant quite quickly. So I tone that down with a little bit of the pyrrol scarlet. And then into that, add just different mixtures of the ultramarine blue and the phthalo blue until I get a color that I'm pleased with. And then I wet my brush a little bit because I want to make sure that it's not too dark. I do want this color to still read as being transparent. So I carefully dot that onto the rooftop of the main house as well as the little extension on the side. And then I take that same color and I dot it around into some of the other green areas just to add a little bit of texture and variety and keep things visually interesting. And once I'm pleased enough with that, I'm mixing up a darker green using the three original colors, the bismuth yellow, the ultramarine blue, and the transparent red oxide. And I'm going to dot that color around into the areas where the deepest shadows are. And that's almost always at the base of bushes or where one bush overlaps another. The one in the distance usually has some darker bits at the bottom. So I'm just taking a few minutes to observe where I see those darkest values and dot those around as well. If you like these narrated tiny paintings, you might want to check out my Patreon, where I routinely put up narrated tiny paintings and also have other tutorials in drawing and color mixing and watercolors. Once I've put in some of those dark shadows, I dilute that color a little bit with some water and put it into some of those trees that are further in the distance. And then I grab another clean ceramic palette, and into that I create a mixture using the transparent red oxide and the pyrrol scarlet. I don't really see a lot of browns and reds in this photograph because the photograph isn't the best, but I know from having painted outside enough that there is a lot of color in nature. So I'm dotting some of this into the cluster of bushes over on the right, and basically just throughout the whole picture where I see little pops of color or where I feel that there would be a little bit more variety. And in the distance where I see a bit of the tree trunks from that tree. And because I did cover up some of that initial lighter value that I put into those distant trees, I'm adding a little bit of that to the very tops of the trees where the sunlight would be hitting the leaves. Next, I want to darken some of the boards on that barn that's peeking out behind the farmhouse. So I use the transparent red oxide and the ultramarine blue to create a gray that I can dot into that area. And then I clean my brush and go into that darker shadow green mixture that I have over on the right. And I'm taking my time here and really paying attention to where I see the darkest darks in this composition and adding just a few pops of that throughout. And again, that's usually going to be at the base of bushes, but also a bit in the foreground, because the way that our eyes see things is that the things that are closest to us are always darker. And this is where drawing or painting from a photograph can get you into trouble, because if you don't understand that, it can be difficult to give the impression of distance and depth in a painting. And then I'm taking that other lighter mixture again and dotting that into some areas where I feel that the color needs to be brightened up a little bit. And my brush is a little bit too wet here, but I'll go in a second and lift out some of those colors. The main thing to remember here is that every time I'm adding a new layer, I'm careful to leave some of the previous layers showing through because I'm trying to create more texture and variety in the color rather than just cover up the entire thing that I've already painted. So I'm really going on the very tip of my brush for this to add in these little dots of color. And you can see I'm just working my way around the painting slowly. I'm varying between those two different mixtures, that middle mixture and the darker mixture, and putting them in where I see them in the composition. And then I'm adding a little bit more pigment to that mixture of the transparent red oxide and pyrrol scarlet to really show some of those areas of reds and browns. And if I add them with the greens, they'll blend in a little bit more, but if I put them in the foreground, they'll be a little bit brighter. But it's by spreading these colors around that I'm creating more visual harmony within the entire piece. And then again, I'm going in with the greens and adding a few more pops of color to brighten some of those. And when I'm completely finished, I'll take a few minutes and dry it off with a hairdryer and then come back in when everything's dry. And I'm using a natural rubber pickup to remove all of the masking fluid that's still on the painting. So I'm removing the masking fluid after I've done the first two layers and before I do the final layer. When I'm painting outside, I usually will use my finger or a vinyl eraser to do this, but honestly, I found that the natural rubber pickup is the best tool for lifting up masking fluid. And this part's always a lot of fun because it really lets you see what you still need to do yet, and it's nice to rediscover some of the white of the paper beneath it. I knew when I put this masking fluid down that it was a little bit thicker than I wanted it to be, but I'm not too bothered about that because I can go in around the areas that I want to be preserved and touch up some of the color. So the first thing I'm doing is going into that reddish mixture again and popping in some of the wood tones in the telephone poles. And I've added a bit of the yellow ochre just to tone it down a little bit. Now I am using the detail brush for this. I don't really love using a detail brush for watercolor because it doesn't hold a lot of color or pigment, so I'm constantly having to dip into the well. Ironically, I find it a little bit more difficult to control than I would the larger brush, but again, I'm just trying to explore different paints and different materials and brushes in this painting. And then I'm taking that filbert brush and lightening the top of the telephone pole a bit because it is lighter from the sun and darker at the bottom. Now, because it is a tiny painting, this inevitably happens. There are some areas that got filled with paint that I really wanted to be a little bit lighter. And so for that, I'm just taking my milky brush and dotting around some of the areas where I want the value to be lighter. I really love this brush. You could use gouache to do the same thing, but I just find this pretty easy, especially since I'm used to painting outside and I don't want to mix up a lot of things. I'll just go in and add a coat of this, let it dry, and then I can layer color on top. I try to be very sparing with this because it is a more opaque color, and I do try as much as possible to keep my watercolor paintings looking more transparent and fresh. While that's drying, I'm taking my fine liner and I'm going in and sharpening up some of the edges. And this is where I think a lot of people go wrong. They just outline everything. And it's very important to understand that in painting, you're going to have edges that are sharper. So we would call those found edges. And then edges that are a little bit more blurry or lost in the composition. So I'm really looking at my source here and trying to decide where the sharpest areas are and just tighten those up, but also leave the areas where things are softer. And then I'm adding just a few more touches at the base of some of the bushes. At this stage of the game, the painting is nearly finished and I want to just add my final touches. I've allowed everything to dry and now I'm going in with a kneaded eraser to erase some of those lines where I had the wires. And then I'm going in again with that fine liner to sharpen up just a few of them. I don't want them all to be sharp because if I was looking at this in real life, I wouldn't see every single line anyway. I just want to give an impression of some of them. And then I'm taking my colors and adding those around the telephone poles where I need to do some touch-ups. Let me know in the comments what other kinds of videos you'd like to see. And again, if you like to see these little paint-alongs, check out my Patreon where I have more of them. And then I'm mixing a muted orangey color with the pyrrol scarlet and a little bit of the phthalo blue and dotting that in some areas where I see color. And then into that mixture, adding a bit of the ultramarine blue to give it more of a violet cast. And I'm dotting that into some of the shadowed areas. And then also darkening some of those shadowed areas because as things dry in watercolor, they get a little bit lighter. And then I'm taking that purpley color again and adding some of the shadows under the eaves of the roof. I'm nearing the end here, and so I'm just mixing up a very light color and adding it over where I put the white of that milky brush in those bushes on the right. And then it's time to look at the final results. I love these tiny paintings because every time I do one, I learn so much about mixing color. And I find that these are so accessible to everybody because anybody can find 20 or 30 minutes to do a little painting. Doing these really helps me understand how important it is to layer a variety of different colors. It strengthens my skills in mixing colors, and it really helps to understand that less is more. There's a tendency to get too detailed with things. And by doing these little paintings, you can really see that a little bit goes such a long way. I hope that this video has been helpful for you if you're on your own journey towards painting tiny paintings. And that's it, a tiny treasure created in less than an hour. And now it's your turn. Turn off this video, get your art supplies, and go make some magic. I believe in you.